बोलिए.
Let me introduce myself. My name is V.S. Datey. I intend to give my observations on the budget presented by Sri Arun Datey on 10th July 2014. In brief, I will give 5 out of 10 marks to the budget because there are few positive issues but many negative issues. I will restrict my comments only on issues relating to indirect taxes. Let me start with some positive changes. One positive change I noticed that in case of service of renting of motor vehicle and tour operators, so far they were not eligible for SENVAT credit. This was creating a big problem for that industry because in that industry getting services from another tour operator or another rent-a-cab operator are very common, while they were not able to get SENVAT credit. Now they will be able to get SENVAT credit, which will be a big relief to that industry. The second clarification which they have given is about services provided to educational institute. Some of the services provided which were defined under auxiliary educational services were exempt from service tax. However, that definition was grossly misused and people were taking a view that any service provided to educational institute is exempt, like even construction services provided to educational institute are exempt. In fact, this was never intention of that definition. To clarify the position, they have clarified that only specified services which are provided to educational institute are exempt. Other services like construction services are not exempt. This is really a clarificatory provision. However, one adverse provision which they have made is that renting services provided to educational institute were so far exempt. That exemption has been withdrawn. Another problem which was faced by the service receiver who were receiving goods transport agency services was regarding proof of non-availment of SENVAT credit by the service provider. The service receiver was liable to pay service tax on 25% of the value of service provided by goods transport agency. However, that 25% provision was applicable only if the service provider had not availed the SENVAT credit. Now this was very difficult for the service receiver to prove that the service provider had not availed the SENVAT credit. Luckily, this difficulty has been realized, and now that condition that the service receiver should prove that the service provider has not availed the SENVAT credit has been withdrawn. There is a good change. Now let me talk about some draconian changes. One major draconian change is mandatory pre-deposit of service tax or excise duty or custom duty and penalty while filing an appeal. Those who are familiar with adjudication procedure in excise, service tax and customs are aware that the adjudication provisions in Central Excise, Service Tax and Customs is practically a farce. Once the show cause notice is issued, you can take it that it will be confirmed along with full penalty and all that. Once the demand is confirmed, you have to file an appeal before Commissioner Appeals if the order was of Assistant Commissioner, Joint Commissioner or Additional Commissioner. So far, there was a provision that Commissioner Appeals could grant stay for recovery and admit an appeal without pre-deposit. Now, the provision that has been made is that if you file an appeal before Commissioner Appeals you have to pay 7.5% of duty and 7.5% of penalty. Without that, your appeal will not be admitted. Thus, effectively, you have to pay at least 15 to 20% of the duty demanded. Again, experience before Commissioner Appeals is not very encouraging. In 95% of the cases, the Commissioner Appeals routinely confirms the demand which has been confirmed by the original adjudicating authority. Now, if you have to file appeal before tribunal, you have to make a further payment of 10% of service tax, excise duty or penalty that has been demanded. Thus, totally you have to pay 17.5% of excise duty, service tax, custom duty and penalty. This is a very draconian provision, because even if you win in appeal, your money is locked for about 5 to 10 years and you lose heavily on interest. And in fact, by the time you get back that money, the value of that money has been so reduced that practically you lose 50 to 70% of money which you had deposited while filing an appeal. And as you know, this money is deposited without any interest. So government gets about 40% of the amount demanded without paying a paisa in interest. Another draconian provision is regarding interest. So far, the provision was that for delayed payment of excise duty, service tax, the interest was 18%. This 18% itself was a very high figure, because even banks, if you borrow, the normally interest rate cannot be more than 14 or 15%. Now that provision has been made more draconian in the sense that this 18% applies only for the first 6 months. For subsequent 6 months, the interest rate will be 24%. And after 1 year, the interest rate will be 30%. Now 30% is not an interest at all. It is really a penalty. Calling that 30% amount as interest is really perversity. That provision is absolutely a draconian provision and has to be reviewed. Some other provisions are there which I won't call it draconian, but these are worth noting. First thing, so far the AC buses for public transport, there was no service tax. Now for public transport also, if AC buses are used, then service tax will be payable on 40% amount. So far, the commission agent of foreign principals were not subject to service tax if they were dealing in goods. That is, suppose you are commission agent in India, you are collecting orders of goods in India and forwarding it to your principal outside India for execution of those orders. The commission agent in India was not subject to service tax. Now that provision has been omitted by amending the place of provision of service rules. And if you are a commission agent of a foreign principal of either goods or services, you will be liable to pay service tax of 12.36%. Another change which is worth noting is that there is now time limit of 6 months in taking SENVAT credit. You must take SENVAT credit in your records within 6 months from the date of invoice. If you do not take SENVAT credit within 6 months, that SENVAT credit will lapse. It may be noted the time limit of 6 months is only for taking the SENVAT credit, that is taking in your records of books of account. Once you take the SENVAT credit in your books, you can utilize it without any time limit. Maybe even after 3-4 years you can utilize that credit, but you must take entry in your books of account within 6 months. I won't call it a draconian provision, but this will ensure that the assessees are alert. Another minor change which is worth noting is that where the service tax is payable under reverse charge, so far time limit of 6 months was available to make payment to the service provider. Now that time limit of 6 months has been reduced to 3 months. That means if you do not make payment to the service provider within 3 months, you have to reverse the SENVAT credit. Of course, this is not a draconian change, but this will ensure that you are more prompt in making payment. These are some of the highlights which I wanted to bring to the notice of the audience. Thank you.